In 1900, a company drilled into a patch of dry Southern California scrubland, hunting for oil. They found none. What they struck instead was water. And that single wrong guess would eventually produce roughly 6 square miles of the most expensive real estate on Earth, a zip code worth more than entire small nations, and a name recognized on every continent. What disappeared in the end was never the oil. It was the idea that this land was ever supposed to be worth anything at all. Long before anyone called it Beverly Hills, Spanish colonists had a name for this stretch of land at the base of the Santa Monica Mountains: Rodeo de las Aguas, the gathering of the waters. Underground springs fed the soil here in a region where, a few miles in any direction, the ground turned to dust and chaparral. Franciscan missionaries had grazed cattle across the same land as early as the 1770s, drawn by the same hidden water table that would matter again more than a century later. In 1838, the Mexican governor of California formally granted the land, roughly 4,500 acres, to Maria Rita Valdez de Villa, a widow who ran cattle across it for nearly 3 decades. Enter Maria Rita Valdez, a California rancher who held title to this quiet, water-rich basin, unaware that the resource sitting beneath her cattle would outlast her name, her rancho, and the century itself. She built an adobe home near what is now the intersection of Alpine Drive and Sunset Boulevard, and for years the rancho produced little more than beef and hides for the Los Angeles Pueblo a few miles east. By the 1850s, American land claims were tightening around Mexican-era grants across California, and the U.S. Land Commission required rancho owners to prove their titles in court, a process that bankrupted many families through legal fees alone. And Valdez, like countless rancho holders before her, was eventually pressured into selling. The land changed hands repeatedly over the next 4 decades. Grazing leases, failed farming attempts, absentee owners. Mostly ignored, mostly empty, valued for almost nothing beyond its acreage. Nobody yet knew the ground beneath it was about to be tested with a drill bit, or that the test would fail in the one way that would make the land worth more than anyone had imagined. In 1900, a group of investors calling themselves the Amalgamated Oil Company arrived convinced this dry-looking basin sat on a hidden reservoir of crude, the same instinct that had already made fortunes a few miles away in the Los Angeles oil fields. They leased the old rancho land and sank exploratory wells across it, chasing the same black gold that had turned nearby patches of scrubland into overnight fortunes for other drillers. Enter Burton Green, a mining engineer and company officer with more patience than most of his partners, who kept the operation running even as well after well came up dry of oil. What the wells produced instead was water, clean, plentiful artesian water, pushing up through the ground almost on demand, exactly the resource this parched region could least afford to waste. In a part of Southern California where water was worth more to any developer than crude oil could ever be, this was, in its way, a lucky kind of failure. Rather than shutting the operation down and writing off the loss, Green convinced his partners to pivot entirely. He reorganized the company in 1906, renaming it the Rodeo Land and Water Company, and quietly shelved the oil ambitions for good. The company's own charter now listed water rights, not petroleum, as its primary asset. Nobody in that boardroom yet understood that a failed oil operation was about to become the most successful real estate gamble in American history, or that the water they'd stumbled onto would still be the subject of public argument more than 100 years later. The new company hired Wilbur Cook, a respected landscape architect who had trained under the Olmsted tradition of American park design, to lay out wide, curving streets and generous residential lots, a radical departure from the grid pattern towns springing up elsewhere across Los Angeles County. Cook's plan reserved broad parkways, deep setbacks, and oversized lots at a time when most Southern California developers were packing houses as tightly as the law allowed. The development needed a name to go with its ambition. According to company lore, it came from Margaret Anderson, wife of one of the officers, who had been reading a newspaper account of President William Howard Taft's summer estate in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts. The name stuck. Beverly Hills, a place that had never seen a hill of any real size and had no actual connection to the small Massachusetts town it was borrowed from. Picture the scene in 1907. Empty, wide dirt boulevards laid out for a city that did not yet exist, ornamental streetlights installed along roads with no houses to light, sidewalks poured in front of vacant lots waiting for buyers who weren't coming. Lots sold agonizingly slowly. By some counts, fewer than 500 people lived across the entire development by the early 1910s. A city designed, platted, subdivided, and named for a version of itself that existed only on paper. It was, in its way, a lucky kind of failure that nobody at the company panicked over because the water beneath the ground meant the land itself was never truly at risk of losing value. It simply had to wait for the right people to notice it. To make the empty streets feel like somewhere worth living, the Rodeo Land and Water Company built an anchor before it built a neighborhood. In 1912, the Beverly Hills Hotel opened at the edge of the development. Pink stucco walls, palm-lined drive, a restaurant, and ballroom serving a town that, at the time, barely existed around it. The hotel wasn't built because Beverly Hills had already become fashionable. Beverly Hills became fashionable partly because the hotel was already there, waiting, betting on a future nobody could yet prove was coming. Its early guest registers show visitors arriving by carriage and later automobile past mostly empty lots and unfinished roads to reach a building that looked, by design, like it belonged to a far grander town than the one actually surrounding it. For its first several years, the hotel operated as something close to an island. Grand, half surrounded by dirt lots, cattle grazing land still visible from its upper windows. The company had, in effect, built the ending of the story before it had written the middle, a 5-star ballroom standing in a field where the loudest sound, most nights, was still coyotes and cattle. Early staff reportedly outnumbered overnight guests on more evenings than the ownership cared to advertise. It would take one very specific kind of resident to finally fill in everything around it. That resident hadn't arrived yet, and nobody at the hotel's opening in 1912 could have named who it would be. Growth stayed slow enough that by 1913, the city of Los Angeles set its sights on simply absorbing the whole development into itself. Los Angeles, sprawling and thirsty, wanted the water rights sitting beneath Beverly Hills far more than it wanted the sparse population living on top of them. A few hundred residents scattered across thousands of largely undeveloped acres. Local residents and the land company fought back hard, organizing petitions and campaigning door-to-door for independent incorporation rather than annexation. The vote, when it finally came, was close enough that either outcome felt plausible right up until the ballots were counted. On January 28, 1914, Beverly Hills incorporated as its own city, narrowly avoiding being swallowed by its much larger neighbor over the very resource that had built it in the first place. The gathering of the waters had almost been the exact reason the city stopped existing before it truly began. Nobody yet knew how close that vote had actually come, or how differently the next century would have looked if a few hundred more residents had sided with Los Angeles instead. An oil company's failed drilling operation had already survived one identity crisis. It was about to face down its second. The small independent city might have stayed a quiet, half-filled subdivision indefinitely, until 1919, when two of the biggest names in the new medium of motion pictures came looking for privacy. Enter Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, the era's most famous married couple, global celebrities of silent film, searching for a home far enough from the cameras of Hollywood to actually feel like home. They built Pickford, a sprawling estate on Summit Drive, complete with its own stables, tennis courts, and a swimming pool that quickly became the subject of newspaper fascination across the country. Almost overnight, Beverly Hills stopped being an experimental real estate project and became the place where fame itself decided to live. Other film industry figures followed within a handful of years: Charlie Chaplin, Will Rogers, Harold Lloyd, studio executives and directors chasing the same combination of proximity to the Hollywood studios and distance from the public eye. By the mid-1920s, the population had grown roughly tenfold from its earliest years, and the city was issuing building permits at a pace nobody in 1907 would have believed possible. The empty boulevards Wilbur Cook had drawn for an imaginary population were finally filling in, with some of the most photographed people on the planet drawn to a town whose entire identity had been invented from nothing less than 2 decades earlier.